Hello. You're listening to the Chronicles, the podcast of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies at Aarhus University. I'm Richard Cole. Snorri Sturluson was born in Iceland in 1179. He was a politician who sought to bring his native country under the power of the Norwegian crown. He was a poet with an extensive knowledge of verse that stretched back generations into the pagan Viking Age. And he was a historian, whose works are still crucial primary sources for the histories of all the Scandinavian countries. He was one of the most eclectic intellectuals of the 13th century, but he did not live the quiet life of a bookworm. He died cowering in his cellar before armed goons dispatched by his former son-in-law, who had eclipsed him as the favourite of the Norwegian king. His last words were recorded by his nephew, the saga author Sturla Þórðarson, as "Egi skal hugva," don't strike, variously interpreted as doomed defiance or pathetic pleading. Without his writing, we would know drastically less about Old Norse mythology. To take just a few examples, Snorri was the only writer to give us lengthy, detailed descriptions of the myth of Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, of Tyr losing his hand to the wolf Fenrir, or indeed of the events surrounding Ragnarok, the apocalypse in which Thor, Odin, and most of the other gods will perish. Joining me to talk about the memories of Snorri Sturluson is Yoav Tirosh, Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow at Aarhus University and member of the Centre for Viking Medieval Studies. Yoav is also the author of a webcomic. Look him up at Viking Comics by Yoav. Yoav, before we get into Snorri, I want to ask you a question which I've been asking all the guests on this podcast. What does the Middle Ages mean to you? Do you think there's some sort of medieval spirit or sense of continuity to the period? Maybe it's a period you'd rather do away with altogether. What do you think?
Well, actually, before I started dealing with the sagas, I hated the Middle Ages. I didn't care. I remember, I had a wonderful teacher in my university, but I just didn't care about the Middle Ages at all. I thought it was boring. All these Germanic people just killing each other. I didn't care. But then I discovered the sagas. So for me, it's really all about Iceland and the sagas and, Scandinavia, of course, and all that. The Middle Ages is, what is it? It's very hard to say what the Middle Ages is, but I don't, if we're talking about Western Europe, yes, of course there's a spirit of Middle Ages, medieval spirit, but of course the concept of Middle Ages is also very ethnocentric, very European-centric, very, we're talking about something very, very specific, and even when we're talking about Middle Ages, you're automatically thinking about Latin culture. You're not thinking about Muslim culture. You're not thinking about Jewish culture. Of course, some people are.
Some of us are.
Yeah, some of us are. But what I mean is this is the way that I hear about the Middle Ages, I think about the old concept of the Dark Ages. So I am a medievalist, but I'm very much an Old Norse-icist more than I'm a medievalist. Though, of course, if you're hiring me, I do everything for, a potential employer.
Well, it sounds like you're exactly the right person to have talking to us about Snorri today. Before we can get to this remarkable individual, Snorri Sturluson, and especially his writing, can we say something about his time and place? I thought maybe we could start with Iceland, the country where Snorri is born in the 1170s. When is Iceland settled, and what's peculiar about medieval Icelandic society?
Wow. I was a tour guide in Iceland in, 2021, the end of 2021, mid-COVID. So a lot of mask touring, 2022. And I had to introduce Iceland so many times. And it's kind of when you talk about something so much that it all kind of blurs. Iceland is reportedly settled in 870, but of course there's documentation of it having been settled even earlier, or at least discovered earlier.
And who's settling there?
So basically we have, I don't know if the term is Celtic or Irish, kind of monks, hermits, hermits, who kind of come to Iceland, as a place of contemplation and, this solitude and, an empty space where volcanoes might erupt and kill you. Very nice. But it is actually quite interesting that from the beginning, Iceland was framed as a place that was prime signed by these hermits that prepared the land for the arrival of the pagan Vikings who later on became...
So we've got some Celtic hermit
we
types
got some
turning
Celtic-
up in the early Middle Ages.
Yeah,
but then we've got this influx of people that we'll, for shorthand, call Vikings.
Yeah, so of course I love calling them Vikings just for the heck of it. But there's research that has shown that actually they were here even before 870. We're in Aarhus, but in Iceland before 870. But let's say that the most significant settlement started after 870. We know this because of the tephra layers. Science, geology stuff. There was a volcanic eruption happening around 870, and there was another volcanic eruption happening in 934, I think, ish. And those two layers are when most of the archaeological evidence has been found. The myth, the story is of Haraldr Hárfagri, fair hair, who kind of settled, who kind of conquered or took over Norway. Sorry, I'm taking over your space.
Keep going.
Okay, yeah.
So tell us. So you're telling us about Haraldr Hárfagri, Harold Hairfair. So this is this semi-legendary king in Norway, active sometime in the late 800s, uniting Norway, and so people in Norway are not liking that. Is that what you're telling me?
That is what I'm exactly telling you. This is this legend around the settlement of Iceland, that in around 870 there was a king called, actually he had Haraldr Lufa. So he was called Lufa, which means kind of like messy hair. It's kind of funny because in Hebrew or Yiddish anyway, there's like lifa, which is like messy hair. So I guess it's probably similar etymology, I guess. Maybe this is folk etymology, who knows. Anyway, yes. So Haraldr Lufa swears that he will grow his hair and not comb it and not kind of cut it until he conquers all of Norway. Very kind of Samson vibes. And then he conquers all of Norway, but in the process, he kills people, he exiles people, he burns people, he takes their stuff in houses. And then, of course, the people from Norway who are, the independent people of Norway, they go to the British Isles and then to Iceland. This is the myth. This is, the myth. This is the legend. The truth of the matter is that there is a lot of Norwegians that settled Iceland. There's also a lot of people who kind of like came from the British Isles, from various Scandinavian roots, people from Denmark, and probably also people from Sweden, less, but mainly Norwegians and Swedes and some, Celtic people.
So various independently minded Scandinavians are turning up in Iceland, late 800s, early 900s, something like that. And that's, of course, a good 200 years before Snorri is born. But what sort of society do they build for themselves? Are there sort of peculiar features about this new settled land compared to other European kingdoms?
So that's a great question, because actually already we're encountering memory here. So I like calling them Vikings. I hope that's fine with you.
It's totally fine with me.
So I'm going to call them Vikings.
You're a member of the Center for Viking Medieval Studies, and this is the podcast for us. So go ahead.
The medieval Vikings that arrived. I'm probably gonna say here a lot in this podcast because I've lived for 12 years in Iceland. So that's kind of like, here is Iceland for me. Anyway, when they arrived to Iceland, they basically brought the same traditions, same legal traditions from Norway. But very soon they started seeing that it doesn't really match very well. It's a very different structure. It's a very different system. They had to start play around with it. So actually what they did is they sent, I think his name was Thorkell Mauni, but it could be wrong. They sent some guy to Norway to memorize properly the laws of, I guess, whatever region he went to. And then he came back, and then he kind of taught them the proper rules. But of course, it kind of formed in its own peculiar Icelandic way. And first of all, one, I guess, interesting thing that I sometimes kind of imagine is obvious, but people don't know, Iceland didn't have a king. It did not have a king. Isn't that shocking? The Middle Ages, medieval times with no king. But yes, that was the case.
Is that because the people who settle in Iceland are deliberately trying not to have a king? Is that the aim there?
I would say that in the 13th century, there was a group of people who were politically oriented against kingship.
And that's a mindset that some people have brought with them even, during the Viking Age, 800s, 900s.
Again, this is 500 years between the 13th century and the settlement of Iceland. Or 400 years. I can't speak conclusively to that. I can say that the 13th century, definitely, there were people that were representing their ancestors as people who were independent-minded. There is signs that indicate that some people did kind of want to remove themselves from the king, but they sought the kings. The whole, I'm sure we will discuss skaldic poetry and, the whole mythology, but the whole orientation of Icelanders was to go to the Norwegian court, the English court, but very much the Norwegian court, Danish court, Swedish court. But again, the center was Norway, at least in the stories. And they were very much orienting themselves there and in many ways treating the Norwegian king as if he was their regent. Was he actually the regent? It's debatable, but I certainly, I would say that Snorri Sturluson, at least, which we will talk, of course, about, he represents in his writing an awareness to people who are independently minded and who do not think that Iceland should not be ruled by a king.
So this kingless period, or this kingless system in Iceland that we've got during the 800s, 900s, and it's going to last up until Snorri's own lifetime, more or less, we often call this the Commonwealth period. It's a bit of a label that we impose from the outside, of course. But can you give us a very brief summary of how does that work exactly? Is there a president of Iceland? If we think of a kingless society, we imagine some other form of government. Is there a form of government in the Commonwealth period of some type?
The system is called the Goðord system, or the chieftaincy system. Actually, there's two systems. There's the Goðord system, which is the chieftain system, and there's also the Hreppur, which is kind of like a social support network, which is less discussed because it's more about people helping each other, not killing each other. So there's less stories about that place, but that's actually a very, very beneficial and quite, I would say, I'd risk saying socialist, but sort of a support network that is separate from Christianity and is separate from the Goðord system. But let's focus on chieftaincy. First of all, the word chieftain in English does not really capture what a goði is, what a chieftain is. The word goði implies God, implies that it had a sort of religious context. So basically, we're talking about some sort of religious leader that in Iceland very much became a chieftain of, or let's say a local leader. Now, why is the word chieftain misleading? Because that implies a tribe. But Iceland wasn't really devised into tribe. It was devised into 4 quarters. It took me a while learning English that the word quarter actually means quarter, and so you can have 5 quarters. Yeah, but no, 4 quarters. 4 quarters, and those quarters were divided into Goðord, into like chieftaincies, governance units. And in the ideal time of Iceland, in the Commonwealth period, as we call it, there would be 1 person per leadership unit. It's a very bad word for it, but I'm trying to avoid the word chieftaincy. And what's interesting about that is that it was not exactly geographical. It was geographical in the sense that you'd have chieftaincies in the north, chieftaincies in the south, in the east, and in the west. So you could be in the northeast of Iceland, and you can have a chieftain from the center of the east of Iceland. As long as he's within your quarter, there's a lot of playing around there, which made it very interesting. And these people, the people who are under this chieftain, they were called thingmen. Like thingmen. And they were very much, as I said, they could choose who their goði, who their leader would be. And that's why the word chieftain doesn't really capture it properly, because chieftain implies maybe like a tribe and something like is immutable. Is that the word? Or something immutable? But no, actually there is freedom. That being said, if your next door neighbor is a chieftain and you swear your loyalty to someone from the next valley, you're probably going to have some trouble because, that chieftain will want you to be on his, under his kind of, that's the thing. What's interesting about the Goðord system is that the financial element is not entirely clear. You know that if someone is your godi, you will support them in court. You will go with them to court and kind of show a force, but there's no clear tributary system financially, and that's a very interesting thing that I think is still, I mean, at least from my perspective, as my position as a literary scholar, not as a historian, I don't think that they properly managed to answer that question. You might know better than me.
Thank you for turning it back on me. That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, there has been, historians have wrestled a little bit about exactly what the relationship is between the godi and his followers, whether it's a tributary relationship or not. But you're right. I don't think the historians have fully decided that for themselves either. And in fact, in some ways, that's perhaps not too unusual. These bonds that people in medieval Europe had are often kind of much more fluid than the historians would like them to be in a textbook, right? Loyalty could be paid in all sorts of ways. Service, turning up, as you said, as a show of force. Sometimes there's a monetary element as well, and sometimes there's not.
If I can interject, okay. Snorri Sturluson's father actually represents the generation where power started to be accumulated, where basically you have chieftains who are taking more than one godor. And you have a person who's basically one person ruling over several chieftaincies and that's when territorialism does develop, because once you have accumulation of godors, you also have accumulation of control of land, of territory.
So, and I think that leads me to another interesting piece that we should probably get on the board: the clan system.
Clown system. Yeah.
The clan system. Apologies for my accent. By Snorri's age, the country is starting to divide itself up along clan lines, isn't it, as well?
So if I was Sverrir Jakobsson sitting here, I would tell you that there's no such thing as clans. At least that's how I understood it. He wrote it in Icelandic. Maybe I misunderstood. But
so these names you'll read about, the Sturlunga clan, for example, or the Svinfellingar clan, or for example, yeah.
So if I don't want to misrepresent his. Okay, let me just talk more general, but I just want to credit Sverrir for this. But yes, if I understand correctly, the development recently is that people are saying, hey, maybe these categories don't really make much sense, because if you look at the life of Snorri Sturluson, he fought a lot with his own brothers, and there was a lot of fights, and they weren't really fighting for dominance over the Sturlungar. They were fighting over control of a place, of control of a certain godord, these kinds of things. They were fighting over the hands of women that they wanted to marry. So even this unit, which you can say the Sturlungar, because it's very clear that you have Sturla Thordarson the Elder. You have Sturla, who was the father of Snorri Sighvatur and Thorður. These are the main brothers, and are these people? I mean, Thorður is up in the West Fjords. Sturla is Sighvatur, because his son Sturla is kind of the main character. But anyway, Sighvatur is up there in Eyjafjörður area, and then you have Snorri, who's kind of in the west. And in many ways, they represent separate forces, even though, of course, because they're brothers, they're less inclined to kill each other.
Okay, let's take the concept of clans and we'll put that to one side then. It seems like we don't need that necessarily to tell the story we need to tell today. I'm going to say something very quickly. I think we've got a picture here of Iceland as, at the time of Snorri's birth, a society at least notionally governed by various chieftaincies that come together and hash things out. Some people are accepting the king in Norway over the water as their regent in some way, but a lot of people aren't doing that. That's what's going on in Iceland. We need to say something, I think, at least in passing, about Norway, the other important country in Snorri's life. So Norway, in comparison, looks a lot more like a standard high medieval European kingdom. Would you say that? Would you agree with that?
I guess that especially in the time of Snorri Sturluson's life, we have kings that are very much trying to establish a European kind of a continental kind of tradition, especially romance, right? They're introducing translations of romance, but also they're trying to take control of their hirðmenn, their
retainers.
Their retainers. They are trying to establish. So in many ways, it's about genre and society and how the two connect. So you're bringing in the romance. You're bringing in this kind of form stories of, King Arthur and his knights. And by that, you're trying to create this courtier society, this retainer society. So I think that is a moment where it really does fit your description. Yes, it's establishing. Yeah.
Yeah, so in particular, although Norway has been somewhat unstable from the middle of the 1100s onwards, there's been a period of civil wars, and Snorri himself will get a little bit involved in that, right? He will go to Norway, and while he's in Norway, there'll actually erupt hostilities between the king, Hákon Hákonarson, and his former regent, Duke Skúli, who's previously been ruling on his behalf. And it's this Norwegian king, Hákon Hákonarson, his court is the court where we normally say that all this activity you're talking about, Yoav, with the Arthurian legends being translated into Old Norse, a bit of political philosophy gets written as well, a lot of stuff about the hirð, this originally Viking age, your bunch of Viking guys who would stand around looking strong, backing up the local king. That now has to be turned into a chivalric, more European-looking aristocracy, and it's under Hákon that's going to happen. Okay, great. Turning to Snorri, when and where in Iceland was Snorri born? Can we say anything about Snorri's childhood, his immediate ancestry, perhaps?
So, again, this is from my recollection of like the essence of it. Snorri was born, I think late 12th century to a very domineering, dominant father who very much fashioned himself after Odin.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Oh, okay. So Kvam Sturla, that's his name. He was very much trying to. He was one of those first Godar, one of the first chieftains. I'm saying chieftains, but of course I don't believe it's chieftains. But anyway, one of these first chieftains, leaders that were trying to accumulate more than one Godar. That were trying to accumulate more than one chieftaincy, one power leadership unit.
Yeah,
and he was, anyway, so Kvam Sturla, he was very domineering, and he was very kind of belligerent, I guess is the term for it. He got into a lot of feuds. And in one very specific instance, this lady, the wife of someone that he was fighting with, that he was trying to take over his land, she took like a knife, she stabbed him in the eye, or tried to stab him in the eye, and she said, here, take out your eye so you'll be like Odin, who you want to be like. Now there... I think you could probably say it more poetically, but basically here's the...
We can have it in Old Norse, actually.
Oh.
Apparently she says, according to Icelandic saga, no, not Icelandic saga, sorry, Kvam Sturluson saga, Hví skal ek ei gjöre þig þeim líkastan þú vilt líkasta verur, and that Odin. Why don't I make you look like the one who you most want to be like? That is to say, Odin, she says to him as she goes for him with a knife. I mean, this is a heck of a thing to say because these people are not pagans, right?
These people are not pagans, but it's kind of... There's a lot of jumping between chronology here, because what's interesting is that they were very much living the... They were very much living the mythology. I could take a comparison to modern, for instance, Israel, where the Bible stories are very much always connected, even if you're completely an atheist or agnostic or whatever, you might always kind of refer back to stories from the Bible and connect things to the Bible. So I think it's very much this kind of same kind of mentality that you have something you don't believe in, but these stories are very much your frame of reference. Like, I guess, England and Jane Austen, you don't no longer believe in Jane Austen. I don't know if that makes sense. But anyway.
They're stories from the past that have this meaning in the present.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's really interesting, because just to make it absolutely clear for listeners, Iceland has been a Christian society for nearly 2 centuries by the time that this little altercation happens.
It's still very much a story that makes sense. And when you stab someone in the eye and tell them that they're like Odin, you are penetrating them, and you are therefore saying that they're used as a woman, as Odin is. So there's a lot of... Sorry, that was a very dramatic sentence to say, but...
so you're referring here to the myth.
Yeah. So Odin is very much perceived as sexually ambiguous. Erninger Franks, for example, talks a lot about, Odin as queer. because he practices magic, he's very much perceived as there's a queerness to him. There's something that is feminine because magic, the practice of magic in medieval Iceland is perceived as feminine.
So that's part of the insult against
that's part of the
Snorri's
insult.
father. So this is something that Snorri must have presumably seen growing up, this somewhat dramatic scene, quite a strange scene, I think. Can we say something about Snorri's rise to prominence? So far, the story we've got is of someone who's the child of a domineering father who's getting into fights and being insulted in these rather strange ways. When does Snorri become someone we should care about?
I think he probably would have grown up to being someone that we care about anyway. However, as a result of this whole stabby thing, the political machinations of a guy called Jon Loftsson, who, interestingly enough, was referred to as the king of Iceland, or the person most fitting to be the king of Iceland, even though he, of course, was not. Jon Loftsson of Oddi.
This is another of these Gothic characters.
Yeah, another very prominent Gothic character. A lot of connections. He was also like the uncle of one of the first bishops. And anyway, well, not first bishops, but one of the prominent bishops. So this good old Jon Loftsson, he took Snorri in. He kind of fostered him. And that was a great honor to Kvam Sturla to have his son, Snorri, fostered by Jon Loftsson. And in Oddi, Snorri really kind of learned so much about mythology, about politics, about society, and how everything works. And from that moment on, you could say that he gained both social capital and cultural capital. He gained knowledge, but he also gained status just by being there.
So he gets this education at Oddi because he's been taken in by this very central figure, Jon Loftsson. Mm-hmm. Can you say something about the sort of education he's getting there? I mean, when we say education, is he sitting down being taught the Latin greats, for example, as a education would have looked in most of continental Europe at the time? What does that education entail? Can we say anything about that?
First of all, I would refer you to writer Patrick Russell's very good book about education, and he is the expert on that. But since I'm here and not him, sadly, I would say that his education was, I mean, again, we don't know exactly what he learned. We assume that he knew some Latin. We know, of course, that he was trained in Latin. But I guess what you're trying to aim at is probably his also knowledge in skaldic poetry and his knowledge of mythology and these kinds of things that he learned. So skaldic poetry, even though this was in, as you mentioned, the Christian times, skaldic poetry in the time of Snorri was very much tied still to references to the mythical past.
What is skaldic poetry?
Oh, good question. I don't know much about skaldic poetry, sadly. But skaldic poetry is it's poetry. It's a form of poetry, and it has a very strict meter, several meters, but like very strict, most of them. I guess the most famous one is Drottkvæð, which is what they would pronounce in front, like in the courts for the kings. But what's the most interesting feature about skaldic poetry, which is the reason that people are, there's various reasons. One of the reasons people are most excited about it is the kenning system. Is this system? I think saying kenning system means saying system. So the kenning system, which is maybe a kind of like metaphor system where you take certain words, you put them together, and they are meant to refer to an event. But by referring to that event, you are saying a word. So you might say a feast for crows, but the feast for crows means battle, right?
A sharer of rings.
Yeah, and that means king.
Reddener of swords for a warrior.
Yeah.
Right? So this system of kennings, this skaldic verse which uses these kennings, that Snorri's getting an education in, why is it important for a young learned person to have a knowledge of skaldic verse?
Well, there's various reasons, but I guess the main reason is, and now we have to kind of zoom a bit outside and see that Iceland was a relatively not attractive place in terms of natural resources. Icelanders coming to Norway didn't have much to offer the king in terms of, maybe if they managed to capture a polar bear, they can bring that polar bear with them and starve it to death, the poor thing. But
this is a reference that
it's a
Yoav
reference
is making to one
a saga.
particular
Let's
text.
not distract ourselves there. Anyway, so there wasn't that many natural resources that the Icelanders could bring. What they could bring was their cultural knowledge, because they mastered very much the art of storytelling and the art of skaldic poetry, and sometimes the art of storytelling through skaldic poetry. And they would use the skaldic poetry as kind of like a way to praise the king, because obviously, because of the strict meter of the skaldic poetry, a poem composed and successfully in skaldic poetry would be easily memorized and would therefore keep the memory of a certain king alive. I mean, a lot of kings, we kind of know about their things, about their actions because of skaldic poetry. And kings are very aware, Norwegian kings were very aware of the importance for their legacy that skaldic poetry did, but also for political reasons. Like, you want people to admire you, right? Because you're trying to unite your kingdom. So one way of keeping your kingdom united is having a certain adoration of you as a character.
One of the main ways that we today know about skaldic verse and have examples of it, it's because it gets quoted extensively in a written down form in the Icelandic sagas. Those are a high medieval product, written. Snorri himself writes some sagas, as we're going to see. But the skaldic verse itself often claims to be as old as the Viking Age, doesn't it? Precisely because of what you're saying, because it's got this very strict meter that you can't really change any little part of it, because if you do, the meter won't function properly.
Yeah, linguists have shown that you can very often see that the language does reflect an older tradition, though there's also a lot of like anachronisms where certain poets, like Snorri, for instance, might actually try to recreate language that is no longer in use, and you can see there's some telling tales like, oh, this is not a correct use, like you remove the U in a place where it shouldn't be removed, this kind of stuff. That's a bad example, but it's fine.
No, I think it's fine. So Snorri has had this education at Oddi. He's been fostered by a great man. Things are looking quite promising for him. It seems to me that he's really gathering momentum and exploding onto the stage of Icelandic politics from something around the year 1200, right? He makes a marriage match. He marries very well, a woman called Herdís in 1199. That gives him access to a very productive estate at Borg. He becomes Lögsögumaður, so that's the person who presides over this big meeting of the Gothar. We're not calling them chieftains, but in 1215. So it's here, I think, around the year 1200, that we've got the beginnings of a political career for Snorri.
I want to interject in the sense that, I did talk about what he learned in Oddi, which is, of course, the skaldic poetry and all that, mythology, and the mythology that feeds into the kenning system. But it is also interesting that he, in many ways, learned law. And law, right? He was taught law by the greats of Oddi. And, Jon Lofton himself his rise to prominence was very much because of his legal acumen. And the role of Lögsögumaður, as Gísli Sigurdsson has, for instance, shown, is very much tied to memory. And even though at this point there was writing, in many ways there was precedence given to memory, to the memory of the Lögsögumaður. The
Lögsögumaður had to recite the law.
Yeah, he had to recite the law 3 times. So not throughout 3 years, he would recite a third of the law every year, and he would have to encompass the entire legal system in those 3 years periods. And that was actually a position of power. Because let's say that you, Richard, your cousin, just let his sheep go into some land in a time of the year that they're not allowed to. But if you, Richard, are the law speaker at that time, you're the Lögsögumaður of that time. If in that year your cousin's trial is going to be in the Alþingi, in the the parliament, in the Icelandic parliament.
That's where all these Gothar get together.
Yeah, that's where they got together and they hashed things out and they did all these trials. if your cousin is being trialed then, and you are the Lögsögumaður, you are the law speaker, you can decide conveniently in that part of the year when you're reciting the law, maybe you're not going to mention this year the fact that you're not allowed to let the sheep do their thing on that specific day because, maybe you want to help out your cousin. And that was a position of power, and you can use it. You could use it for power. But it was also just, there was a lot of legal dealings and stuff. So even if you were, totally legit with telling the law as it is, whatever, it was just it was a unit of power in the sense that you would have to be involved in a lot of debates, you would settle a lot of problems, and that, of course, means that people should be nice to you. Sagas written in the 13th, 14th, 15th century would represent stories from the 10th, 11th century where the Lögsögumenn, the law speakers, would remove elements or maybe not mention things, conveniently, especially in Brennu Njal saga, the saga of Njal the Burner. That was cheeky of me to call it that way. But anyway, you have stories about, I think it's Skafti, who is the law speaker, and he decides to not tell certain things, or he says like, oh, I thought I was the only one who knew this law. It's like...
So Snorri gets clearly accustomed to wielding political power, and he gets accustomed to intrigue. We've got Snorri the politician in place here. I want to look a little bit at Snorri the author.
I reject this separation. I think that separation is childish, Richard. No offense.
Go on, please.
No, Torvi Tillinius and Kevin Warner have both kind of talked about this concept of Bourdieu, of the tying between cultural capital, social capital, the idea that power, that political dealings are somehow separate from his skaldic poetry and from his creative side, I think is ignorant.
Okay, well, fair enough.
I'm sorry, I'm just being
not a problem, Yoav. I'm actually quite inclined to agree with that myself. But for the purposes of this episode, can we get a survey of some of his historical writing? Now, I'm aware here, before I'm rightfully condemned for my ignorance once again, that what we call, when we divide Snorri's work up into his historical writing or his mythological writing or his poetic treatises, we're doing something artificial. It's probably not a difference that he necessarily would have acknowledged himself. But nonetheless, can we sort of get a sense of the works that we, in the textbooks at least, would call his history writings?
So, of course, Heimskringla is kind of like the most famous thing that he supposedly had a hand in writing. But we for sure know that he wrote a part of it, like one of the Olavers. I can't recall which of them. Is it Tryggvason or the other? No, it was Helgi. Right?
He writes one of the
one of the
of Olaf the Holy.
Olaf the Holy. So he wrote Olavur Olavur Helgi the Fat. So he is one of the. He wrote like a very long saga, kind of about him. But in that saga that was written about him, has been ascertained by Snorri, is incorporated into Heimskringla, which is also supposedly, at least partially, written by Snorri. Heimskringla is basically this history of all the kings of Norway, from the mythical kings, all the way, I mean, even before Haraldr Fairhair that we discussed earlier, all the way to, well, I don't remember who was the king that was before Sverrir, but all the way to the king before Sverrir, because that's where it ends. Some people say that it is because Sverrir's saga, which existed at that point, was so prominent that there was no need to rewrite it. I don't know if that's true, whatever. But anyway, yes, Heimskringla is a text that most people say confidently was written by Snorri, at least partially.
And Heimskringla is essentially a collection of sagas. Mm-hmm. And when we say a saga, we mean one of these prose narratives with little bits of poetry sprinkled in between. And each saga is focused around a different Norwegian king.
And Snorri is very explicit. Snorri, again, we're talking about the author of Heimskringla, is very explicit about the fact that he uses the skaldic poetry for verification. That he thinks, what I just said about what I said earlier about the meter being very strict, that is something that Snorri said. He said that it's very hard to change skaldic poetry, and therefore it preserves history very well. I mean, is this correct or not? I'm not one to say. But we also know this from other, like the very famous Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, who also talks about Icelanders as kind of people who remember very well the past. So in many ways, this is because of the skaldic poetry and its system. There's also a text that I hesitate to mention, but I guess you probably will get to it, so I'd rather bring it myself. It's Egil Saga.
Yeah.
Skallagrimssonar.
So another saga, but not about a Norwegian king this time.
Not about a Norwegian king. Well, sort of. It's about a Norwegian guy called Skallagrimur who leaves Norway and goes to settle Iceland, and his son Egil Skallagrimur, Egil Skallagrimsson, who fights a lot of Norwegian kings. So in many ways, he feels like he's the equal, I guess, to kings, because he goes into feud with these Norwegian fellows. The thing about that saga has never been established that Snorri is the author. So
there's no medieval text that says Snorri wrote Egil Saga, by the way.
Yeah. And unlike Heimskringla and Snorri Edda, which I guess you'll get to, where there's more explicit mention.
So we've got Heimskringla, we've got Egil Saga, but we're putting a massive question mark next to that one. Mm-hmm. What about texts that, I hesitate to say this, really I do, but we'll call them mythological works. Can we say something about this text here, the prose Edda? Maybe we should start by, when we say the word Edda, actually specifying a bit what we mean. So there's this thing called the poetic Edda that's got nothing to do with Snorri, right?
I wouldn't know if it has nothing to do with Snorri, but at least in its current form, we don't associate it with Snorri.
So the Poetic Edda is this collection of mythological poems that appear to be really quite old. Right? A lot of them appear even to date from the pagan period, although it must be a Christian who's written them down.
That being said, Snorri does cite as well, but he quotes from Völuspá, which is a text that is in the
what we call these Eddic poems.
Yeah, in these Eddic poems.
The poems that we find in the Poetic Edda, yeah.
So he cites it as verification for his own prose telling of the mythology. So the idea behind Snorri Edda, Snorri,
just to get this on the board here, because the listeners might not be as steeped in Old Norse philology.
Yes.
When we say the word Edda, we could be referring to two texts or two types of text. We've got the Poetic Edda, this collection of ostensibly Viking Age mythological poetry, but then Snorri also writes a text that we call Snorri Edda, Snorri's Edda, or sometimes we call it the Prose Edda. You might sometimes see it called the Younger Edda. The beloved child has many names, as you say in various northern languages. So can we say a little bit about this text? Let's agree to call it Snorri Edda for now. The Edda that's Snorri's Edda.
I like calling it Snorri Edda. There is medieval attestations of Snorri as an author, so it's not as controversial to call it.
Yeah. There's one manuscript of the Edda where there's a clear label saying basically Snorri wrote this.
Yeah. And so at least know that he did a variant, at least one version of it, right? And so good old Snorri, he was as we know, he was a poet, and he realized that this memory of the mythology, of the Viking mythology, right? The Aesir, the story of the gods, the story of the gods and their fight and their destiny. He realized that his role, his uniqueness, what he has to offer to the Norwegian king as poet will go to waste in the generations that come after him if the stories of the gods are not preserved. So he set out, and again, this is kind of the rationale. It's written that there's a fear of the loss of the memory of the mythology. So he set out to try and narrativize, to tell a clear story of what the mythology of the Norse mythology, and in many ways you can see that he's trying to create a story out of a lot of very contradictory stories and a lot of very contradictory tales.
Is it fair to say that the reason he's actually recording all this mythological stuff, it's not so much because he's a sort of anthropologist or historian who wants to preserve these ancient stories. It's really because you need to know the stories to understand these kennings, these strange metaphors that are an integral part of Skaldic verse. So in a way, we've got Snorri, and we're lucky enough to have Snorri telling us all these myths, but it's not so much because he directly wanted to save the myths, it's because he wanted to save Skaldic poetry, and you need the myths to understand the Skaldic poetry.
Yeah, I mean, so like I was saying, the role of the Icelanders in court was in many ways relied on their ability to tell skaldic poetry, to compose skaldic poetry on the go. You had to have these stories in your head all the time. You had to memorize them almost, so you could see a situation and say, "Oh, this is like when Sigurdur slew Fafnir." So I would say that it's not an entire. I did go up with my voice. I would say that it's not an entirely egocentric thing, because obviously he knows the stories. He wants his people to thrive. He wants at least the Icelanders. He wants them to still have a place in court. So I think it is very much of a. Yeah, he doesn't care about the myth, but he does care about his people. I think it is a very kind act of his. It could be also an act of, cultural capital. I am the one giving this to you. But the fact that he does it, I think, is quite considerate of his people, and he wants to keep them in a state of power. And he knows that the Icelanders' power is through their ability to praise kings through skaldic poetry, which is built on the stories, the myth of Odin, Thor, Iron Man, and those guys.
And when we say sort of his people in this regard, we're talking about sort of elite Icelanders who need to make contacts with the Norwegian court, right? Because, I mean, Snorri, paradoxically, as a politician, is actually working to bring Iceland under Norwegian control.
So that's disputed. Is Snorri really trying to... I mean, Snorri did write Heimskringla, and Heimskringla does have a speech where Einar of Þverá explicitly says we should not have a king because a king will just cause us trouble. And he says this to his belligerent, annoying brother Gudmundur, who is, of course, kind of contrasting him. Anyway, there's a scene in Heimskringla where Einar of Þverá reacts to the attempt of one of the Norwegian kings to take over the island of Grimsey, which is an island right on the outskirts of Iceland. And he gives this very impassioned speech to the people of the island that they should not agree to the sale of Grimsey to the king, because that would give him a foothold in Iceland. The fact that Snorri wrote this means that again, assuming he wrote Heimskringla, the fact that he wrote this means that even if he doesn't 100% agree with it, he is aware of it and he has a complex understanding of what it means to have a king. These are not people who just want power. They have they do want power. He did care, but you can see that Snorri cares about his people. He cares about the tradition. He doesn't just care about himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't write such a speech, because that speech goes almost against the interest of himself of, gaining control over the island for the king. I think that part of the reason that people say that maybe the king basically killed Snorri is not only his support for Duke Skulli, who was kind of leading a civil war against the king, but it could also be that he saw that Snorri was dilly-dallying, or he was like using techniques of kind of stalling techniques, not stalling techniques, trying to delay the capture of Iceland by the king. Is this true? I'm not entirely sure, but he wrote this text. I mean, he explicitly voiced the opinion. So I think that even if he was working towards letting the king take control of Iceland, he definitely had a complex understanding of what that means and what that entails.
There's potentially a prize for whichever Icelandic chieftain it is who succeeds in achieving the union of Iceland and Norway, right? Like, if the person who makes that happen is presumably going to be rewarded quite mightily by the Norwegian king, potentially by being made an earl over the entire island.
Or having your house burned down and all your sons die. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm referring to Gizur Thorvaldsson, the guy who actually ordered the death of Snorri Sturluson. And Gizur didn't have, such a nice life after that. Like, after I think it was, I can't remember the exact year, but towards his takeover of Iceland in the name of the King of Norway, his farm was burnt in a very dramatic fight, following actually a wedding of the nephew of Sturla's daughter. Never mind. These Icelandic politics.
They're all related to each other.
They're all related.
Nothing
to each
has
other.
changed.
Yeah. But after a wedding, there was a burning of Gizur Thorvaldsson's house. His wife died. I think most of his kids died. A lot of people died there. Not very pleasant. And that was his kind of like, yeah, he won the kingdom, but at what price? A kingdom for my horse. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it was Hrapd Oddsson and I think Thorvaldur Thorarinsson, one of those Thorvalders, who really took over Iceland. They were the ones that controlled Iceland for the longest time after. They're the ones that really operated. Gizur was a transitory figure who helped Iceland kind of turn into, like, gain the control of, who helped the king gain control of Iceland, but it wasn't him that really reigned. He wasn't him that really controlled this world after the takeover of the Norwegian king. It was more Hrapd Oddsson and other characters.
I sometimes think of that situation there around the 1260s. It's 1262 when union with Norway is finally achieved. It's a bit like musical chairs, the game of musical chairs. Iceland, up until that point, it is a constant jostling for power. The one who can be there when the music stops, in theory, stands to gain something. Although, as you point out, Yoav, how much Gizur really gained is doubtful. We're going to come back to the downfall of Snorri when we round up, but I do want to ask you one or two things before we round up here. So we've got these works. There's this historical stuff, Heimskringla. There's this mythological stuff, what we're calling Snorri Edda. You've been very careful, much more careful than I have, Yoav, and it's commendable, to introduce some... There are doubts about how far Snorri wrote any of these works, actually. I'm going to give you the opportunity to put that case for the doubters, the people who would say, no, it wasn't Snorri who wrote these things. It's all a later kind of convention.
I would say that, of course, there's a complex issue of medieval authorship. What is medieval authorship? Is a medieval author the person who is actually sitting down and writing, the scribe? Is the medieval author the person who is dictating to the scribe?
Which in continental Europe would often be the case, right? We have a named author for all sorts of continental European texts, but it's probably someone giving dictation to a secretary.
Yeah. Or is the medieval author actually the producer, right? Like in a modern TV series, is it the executive producer, the person who is giving the instructions, saying, okay, you copied out this part of the saga, you copy out this part of the saga, and he's just laying back there and, managing things or managing his farm while his scribes are doing everything. So we don't really know to what extent the word authorship even it means that he composed it. That being said, because he was the one that kind of assigned the text to the scribes, he had a choice. He had a choice of material. So I would say he's involved, again, probably in Heimskringla. But also a lot of this has to do with the fact that I almost cry now thinking about it. We lost the oldest manuscript of Heimskringla called Kringla. It was lost in the fire. When was it? 18th century, when Árni Magnússon, the collector of Icelandic manuscripts, he, I don't know, fell asleep and burned Copenhagen or something. Copenhagen was burning, and with it, a lot of the Icelandic manuscripts. We have Kringla, the medieval manuscript that preserved the earliest attestation of Heimskringla, and that people say might have been like really from the mid-13th century, very close to Snorri. But the point is that because of the state of preservation of medieval Icelandic manuscripts, we can't really say how it looked when it was first scribed, because every iteration of a text, every recopying of a text, there is a change. It's almost impossible to do. I mean, biblical scholars will show you that, I guess there is ways to do it, but it is very rare. It is very rare to have a text that's word by word. I mean,
over time, these texts are copied out and they change.
So it could be that the most captivating sentence in a certain saga is actually an addition by a later scribe. So that is to say that medieval authorship is very problematic as a concept, to say it's exactly this person. That being said, Torvi Tullinius has shown a lot of compelling evidence about how Egil Saga, for example, works very well in the context of Snorri Sturluson's life. But it could also be that it's a person who is trying to impress Snorri and trying to show, hey, Snorri, look at me. I know how to write your life in a cool way. So, I mean, yeah.
I'd like to very briefly give my views on that.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me there's this famous phrase by Voltaire that, if God didn't exist, we would have to invent him, right? And I often think about that with Snorri. If Snorri didn't exist, we would have to invent him. If Snorri wasn't a named author for something like Snorri Edda, for example, or Heimskringla, particularly here, the mythological stuff, well, we'd be looking for an aristocrat with connections to Norway, with a deep knowledge of mythology. We know that we've got these stories about, his father having an eye put out and being insultingly called Odin. We know that Snorri actually composes a poem in the 13th century where he compares the two warring parties in Norway, Duke Skuli and Haakon, to these semi-legendary Norwegian kings, and he compares another Norwegian courtier, a guy called Gauter Jonsson, to Odin, riling them up. We know that the tent that Snorri had when he came to the Alþingi, he called it Valhalla. Basically, whether or not he wrote Snorri Edda, I think he did, he was a massive mythology nerd, right? So I think even if we didn't have these texts, sooner or later someone would have suggested Snorri as an author. And the fact that there are actually medieval texts that say he was the author, when you add those two things up, to me it becomes quite safe, actually.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, especially not about Snorri Edda, but also not really about Heimskringla. I would just say, I just mean that when we talk about word choice and these, right, what is authorship? Is authorship the mere fact that he wrote a handbook for mythology for skaldic poets, or is authorship the specific words that the author chose? So that it's how we think about authorship. This is an iteration of a text that Snorri had a hand in composing. I definitely agree with you in that, especially about Snorri Edda and probably about Heimskringla too.
Fantastic. We've got to round up now. I think the point I'd like to wind up with is the downfall of Snorri Sturluson. How does it start to go wrong for him politically? How does he end up being murdered in his basement with these last words?
Well, I think that we can't talk about his last words before we talk about his penultimate last words, which is so Snorri was, as you mentioned, he was supporting Duke Skuli in his civil war against King Haukonason, and Duke Skuli failed, and before he was just Snorri was kind of stranded there, and the King Haakon wanted him to come and kind of maybe show him lealty, show him fealty, yeah. That
and of course Haakon issues a law, right, saying no Icelanders are allowed to leave Norway without my permission.
Exactly, but Snorri says ut vil jeg, which means I want out. Why does it say ut and not? Well, I mean, what does it mean by out? That is because Icelanders refer to themselves as being in the out. Iceland is outside. Of course, inside is continental Europe, or more specifically, Norway. So ut vil jeg. So he, despite this restriction, he wanted to get to Iceland. He got to Iceland. He settled in his house, had a nice time. I think he went. That was 1237 or around about. But Gizur Thorvaldsson, who we mentioned earlier, that nice old chap, he was told by the king, I want Snorri alive or dead. So he heard dead there. Gizur was, at that point, the former son-in-law of Snorri Sturluson. He was married to his daughter and then was not anymore. And at this point, he sent his men to attack Snorri at his home in Reykholt. And Snorri went to his cellar. He hid there, cowered in the corner or something. And then these two people, at least two people, there was like band of warriors, but there were like two people involved that one of them was like saying, you should, strike. And then Snorri says, Eigi skal hugva. And then the other guy says, you shall strike. And he says, Eigi skal hugva. And
Eigi skal hugva literally means not shall strike.
Yeah, not shall strike, or shall not strike. And then the guy strikes and Snorri is dead. It is, like you mentioned at the very beginning, was he saying this in cowardly, like, no, please don't hit me, sir? Or was he saying it as in, you shall not strike, like a hero? We'll never know. But, I mean,
What do you think?
What do I think? I think he was cowering. I mean, I don't know that. I think the most, well,
I think that too, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, if I was in that situation right now, if I'm trying to do remote viewing and trying to live in that, I just remember, if I was trying to do remote viewing and trying to going to the past and trying to understand what's happening there, I imagine that he was astonished that this is happening to him. So it was like saying it in almost disbelief. You shall not strike. You're not going to hit me. I'm Snorri Sturluson. He had a very elevated perception of himself, clearly. I think that's maybe the way that he said it. Not in ordering and not in cowardice, but in kind of disbelief that this is happening to him. Almost. That's how I feel, probably.
That's brilliant, Yoav. I'm going to ask you one question, then we're going to round up.
Yes, UFOs exist.
We're going to have to keep that, producer Kirsi. How is Snorri remembered today? Does the Icelander on the street today remember Snorri and think of Snorri?
I think that's a question for Simon Halink, best person alive. How is Snorri remembered today? He's still a very, one of the main roads of Iceland in Reykjavik are called Snorra.
Is it Snorravegur? Actually, not been in Reykjavik.
Oh my God, Snorrabraut. And what's amazing is that it ends with an underground passage. I love it.
Yoav is referring to the fact that Snorri's farmstead had an underground passage in it.
No, also just that he dies in the cellar. He dies in the cellar, and the street ends with an underground passage. I just love it. I would say that Snorri is still quite admired. He's still perceived as this, independent person. That's why also Icelanders, they're always playing around with was he really trying to get Iceland under the control of the Norwegian king, or was he kind of playing like this? If anyone read Færeyinga Saga, is he like this Thraundur who's trying to manipulate the king and kind of have one foot in independence and one foot under the control and try to keep it stalling techniques. I think that Snorri will probably, as long as Iceland exists, I cannot imagine a world where people don't know who Snorri Sturluson is, a world where people in Iceland don't know who Snorri Sturluson is, just because he's so key in the memory of the Eddas, which, by the way, we didn't refer to, but in many ways, could be understood as grandmother tales, but also the story of Odi. There's various interpretations of what Edda even means, but this is Snorri. Snorri preserved the stories of the myth, the very establishing myth of Icelanders in many ways. So I think that his memory will never be forgotten. There's always events happening in Reykholt where he was killed brutally. I think people, I went to a lecture there. There were there's
a Snorri Institute.
There's a Snorri Institute there, and there was a lecture that I attended. And just people flock there, and it's a center. And I think that Icelanders will not as long as Iceland is settled, as we say in the sagas. As long as this land is what is it? As long as this land is settled, the memory of Snorri will not go away.
Yoav, I'm really glad you could join us to help keep the memory of Snorri alive here in podcast form. Thank you so much for coming on. The Chronicles was funded by Aarhus Universitets Forskningsfond. Sound production and original music was by Kirsi Tilk of Tilk Sonics. If you're interested in news and events at the Centre, you can visit our website at cas.au.dk/cvm. I've been Richard Cole. Thank you for listening.